Jesus never explicitly mentioned same-sex sexual relationship. But he does talk about marriage quite a bit. And that's why I want to bring it back to, he actually addresses more clearly than anybody else in the Bible the fundamental question we should be asking. Mm-hmm. It's because people don't ask that question. They think all this talk about marriage, they just don't think it's relevant. But he clearly said marriage is between a man and a woman in Mark 10 and Matthew 19. And people are like, well, he still doesn't address same-sex sexual relationships. I guess we have to ask the question, why? You know, like there's not a single positive reference from a Jewish writer 500 years on either side of Jesus that said anything positive about same-sex sexual relationships. It was unanimously a non-issue. Like everywhere, and Judaism was very diverse, right? Mm-hmm. I mean, the Sadducees, the Pharisees, the Herodians, the sellouts, the Zealots. You know, wide diversity in Judaism. But when it came to same-sex relationships, there was no debate. Well, when we look at what Jesus addresses in the Gospels, he's often addressing issues that were debated within Judaism about divorce and Sabbath and this and temple and all these things. He's not going to preach a sermon talking about something that is just non-existent in Judaism at that time.
Good.
It's something that I
never thought about that.
So, I mean, I don't like using analogies, but I'm sure we could all think of things that every single Christian agrees is sin, and then you guys the question, well, how? I've never heard a sermon on it. In 10 years in church, never heard a sermon on fill in the blank. And it's like, do you need to preach a sermon on something that for sure. That everybody agrees with? So
I think to draw that, I would like to hear you kind of dig a little deeper into even Jesus' affirmation of marriage and how he pulls from Genesis 1 and 2 in explaining what marriage is, and how really, if he speaks to marriage being a union between male and female, then that kind of already answers the question.
Yeah, exactly. So in Matthew 19, he's in a conversation about divorce. And to argue against divorce, all he really needs to do is cite Genesis 2:24. A man will leave his father and mother, be joined to his wife, and the two will become one flesh. What God has brought together, let no person rend asunder. Why do I want to say that? Is that old King James?
I think
rend asunder.
I feel like
that's old King James.
I feel like you trying to marry us again.
You could just say separate.
Separate.
Like I'm
I don't even own a King James Bible. I don't know where that. Wow, that's weird. So all then that alone would be sufficient. But he actually goes out of his way to not just cite Genesis 2:24. But he cites Genesis 1:27, God created them male and female, and then he splices it together with Genesis 2:24. Therefore, and the two will become one flesh. So he goes out of his way to reference the most significant verse about sex difference, Genesis 1:27.
Yeah.
And brings it into the logic of what marriage is.
That's
so
good.
I think that's probably, if you want like one. If someone said, what is the single most important passage in this conversation, it would probably be Matthew 19 to me.
Wow, that's really good.
And I don't like to, I think there's lots of important things, but I think that is probably the clearest, illustration of what marriage is. And again, I mean, we're having this kind of having to explain this. Yeah. For 2,000 years, the global church, we're like, well, why are we even talking about this? Yeah. Like it wasn't obscure to the global church up until, 5 minutes ago in